Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into something incredibly fascinating, Al Quran and reasoning. We're going to completely decode how this ancient text actually lays down a remarkably rigorous framework for absolute logic. We're stripping away the traditional lenses you might be used to, and instead we're tearing down the precise structural mechanics of its reasoning. We're talking analogies, variables, cross-scale logic, the whole shebang. So buckle up because this is absolutely going to shift how you look at language, metaphor, and literally logic itself. Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a massive, fundamental cognitive dilemma to deal with right off the bat. How exactly does our profoundly limited human brain digest a concept that is completely infinite? Think about it. We are beings totally bound by time, space, and our physical senses, right? So when an infinite, boundless message needs to be communicated to a finite, bounded mind, well, we hit a monumental bottleneck. How does that communication even happen?
Which perfectly sets up Section 1, Understanding the Infinite.
Now, before we get to the solution, we've got to clearly define the boundaries of the problem. On one side, we have an infinite God, the absolute, and on the exact opposite side, we've got the limited human mind, the relative. There is a literal, hard boundary here. According to the source text, our brains just naturally cannot digest anything that exists entirely outside of our sensory experience. It's kind of like trying to explain the color red to someone who has never had sight, or, explaining a four-dimensional shape to a three-dimensional being. The hardware simply isn't built to run the software. So to make the absolute understandable to the relative, the message literally has to be converted. And that brings us to Section 2, Analogy as a Logic Bridge. To cross this massive gap, the text uses a brilliant workaround, analogies. But not just as pretty poetic flair, we're talking about highly functional logic bridges. It takes the infinite and essentially translates it into a recognizable human language. The source material highlights this perfectly with a specific verse. Indeed, Allah is not timid to present an example, that of a mosquito or what is smaller than it. Now, the text explicitly points out that historically, and honestly even today, a lot of people hastily reject these concepts. They read about a mosquito and think, wait, what does a bug have to do with divine, absolute truth? But by reacting that way, they completely miss the underlying logical framework. They just don't see the bridge. And this brilliantly illustrates how the text intentionally uses super common, concrete sensory items to map out highly abstract truths. Just think about it for a second. A mosquito, a fly, a spider building a fragile web, the nature of light, or the way water flows. These are physical, tangible realities that someone living thousands of years ago, or a quantum physicist today, can easily observe and understand. By tethering an infinite abstract concept to a concrete variable like a spider, the text essentially builds a really sturdy bridge for our limited minds to walk across.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Mennalar Lintas Scala, or cross-scale reasoning.
To really grasp cross-scale reasoning, we first need to define a core concept from the source material, modular reasoning. Think of this exactly like algebra. In modular reasoning, a word is basically treated as a variable. Just like an x or y in math, a word's value, whether that's a quantity or a quality, can totally change depending on the context. But the structural rule itself, that remains absolutely identical. To see how this builds, let's just consider basic physics for a second. We all know that velocity equals distance divided by time. The v, s, and t are just variables. The actual numbers you plug in can change constantly, but the formula itself is absolute law. Now, apply this exact same logic to linguistics. The text uses words as variables, functioning with changing quantities or qualities, operating totally inside rigid logical formulas. Let's dig deeper into this in Section 4, the modular variable concept. To really lock this in, we're going to look at what is probably the most mind-bending example from the source material. We're going to take a famous ancient metaphor and treat it exactly as the text intends, as a rigid, universal, modular formula. You've probably heard this phrase or some variation of it before, and they will not enter paradise until a camel enters into the eye of a needle. For centuries, right, people have read this and just thought of it as colorful, poetic imagery, basically meant to say, hey, it's really hard. But the source material argues that this isn't just poetry at all. This is a mathematical statement of absolute truth, just waiting to be logically decoded. Now, what's truly fascinating here is how we can break this exact metaphor down into modular steps. Let's decode it together. Step 1, the camel. In our logical formula, the camel simply represents the variable of large capacity. Step 2, the eye of a needle. This represents the variable of small capacity. Step 3, The interaction between these two variables yields a universal truth, and that truth is a large capacity is absolutely impossible to fit into a smaller capacity. The camel and the needle, they are just the sensory bridge. The underlying formula is what really matters.
And here is where we hit that concept of Lintas Scala, or cross-scale reasoning. That logical truth, that a massive capacity cannot be forced into a smaller one, is not just a rule for animals and sewing equipment. It applies to literally everything in the universe across all scales. It applies to macroeconomics and trade. It applies to the complex interactions of molecules in chemistry. It even applies all the way down to the atomic or quantum scale. The law is unbreakable no matter how far you zoom in or zoom out. So, the crucial point is this. Once you understand the formula, you can literally plug in any variables you want, swap them out. For example, the sun cannot fit into the earth. Completely true. Or swap them again. 1 liter of liquid cannot fit into a container under 1 liter. Also completely true. You can endlessly swap these modular variables out, but because the underlying structural equation is absolute, the truth remains perfectly 100% intact.
Which leads us to the final piece, Section 5, Dismantling Logical Fallacies. So, why does all this actually matter for us today? Well, understanding how this ancient framework operates isn't just some fun linguistic exercise. It is a highly practical tool for our modern lives. The source material suggests that if we are patient enough to deeply reflect on these modular reasoning rules, it fundamentally upgrades our mental software. It empowers us to quickly detect absurd arguments in our daily lives. But more importantly, it uncovers hidden, disguised logical traps, the kind of fallacies that we might not even realize we're falling for, because they're wrapped up in complex, confusing words. By breaking arguments down into variables and checking the underlying formula, you basically become immune to bad logic.
Which leaves us with a critical thought to end on. Look closely at the arguments you construct, the media you consume, and the decisions you make every single day. Ask yourself, are we truly reasoning using universal cross-scale logic? Or are we just trapped in unseen logical fallacies, totally confusing the variables for the formula itself? Take a page from this ancient framework, start looking for the bridges, test the capacities, and don't let the noise of the variables distract you from the absolute truth of the equation. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.